Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Julie Satow, the author of When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion. This is her second book, and she is now a friend of the show because this is her second appearance. Believe it or not,
So
she was on. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. Oh, I'm
No,
so
please.
sorry.
Believe it or not, it's all right. Believe it or not, she was on episode number 8 back in August of 2020 to talk about her book on the Plaza Hotel. And here we are almost 5 years later, taping an episode that will be in the number 150 somewhere. Julie, I hold in very high regard people who agreed to tape with me before I barely even had an episode to my name. And indeed, you're one of those people. Welcome back, Julie.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so much fun. And I remember that episode. We just did it via telephone, if my
I,
memory is
I,
correct. I
I,
think I was in a closet somewhere to try to get my sound okay for you.
Yeah,
So
and it's funny because sound has improved greatly as we've all adapted to this Zoom age, and now we're looking at each other over Zoom video chat. So that's fun. Before we get going here, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Julie writes that in the early 20th century, that at least in the city, in terms of city life all over, certainly the United States, department stores were the center of life. You could do anything. You could shop, you could send letters, you could meet friends, you could have a snack, learn the latest trends. But this was not a place for men. Women ran the show, and it became vital to their lives. Is that a happy, positive truth, Julie, or does that reflect something negative and sad about the way society was?
oh wow, you begin with a real interesting question. And no one's asked me that. I think it was a reflection of where society was. At the beginning, when department stores were really starting, the industry was starting, women, this is 1800, late 1800s, Gilded Age, there was actually sort of, it was looked down upon for women to walk by themselves in the streets, to go unchaperoned without male companions in public. So the department store actually was this wonderful opportunity for women to gather together without the need for male chaperones. So is that sad that they needed that? I think it was, how society worked. So it was just the reality.
Le Bon, I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Le Bon Marché, is that right?
Excellent. Yes.
Perfect. 1838, Paris. Where and what was the first department store, and why was it Paris that set the mold?
Why Paris? Paris is the center of fashion. It had been for generations, really up until basically the 1940s. Paris was kind of yeah, it was the capital of the world for fashion. And the founder of Le Bon Marché, and my French is not perfect either, but he really had this innovative idea for shopping. He wanted to create an experience, an entire universe where anyone could walk into a store, regardless of whether they were going to actually buy something, and look at the, parasols or the silk, ribbons, and just be able to take in the environment. And it was, he was all about sort of marketing and letting people have this experience rather than just before you had to go to a store, you had your errands to run, you bought what you bought. It wasn't a pleasurable activity. So he really changed that. And he also changed kind of the way goods were organized. Up until then, there were really dry goods stores, and everything was a jumble of, coffee cans and flour and whatever it might be, wagon wheels all together and not organized. And he put everything in departments. He made it very easy for people to shop, to find what they might be looking for. So he really revolutionized the way that whole experience was. And also, I should say, he created these big windows, which hadn't been a thing either, where you could have these mannequins dressed in all these wonderful outfits, and you could walk by, and it was a form of entertainment.
Believe it or not, that when I after I was done preparing for this episode, because I had typed in the words, I guess, department store and history at some point on my device, I started getting pictures on Facebook of old department stores. And the pictures of the insides were unbelievable. Can you describe what early department stores look like? I mean, this isn't even like on the charts of what I expected to see as a store.
No, they were incredible. They were palaces of consumption. They were these wonderlands. You would go in, I mean, you also have to think about the way people lived back then. You would go in and there would be escalators or elevators, things that people had no idea about. There was electric lights. In New York, the first big department store was the Crystal Palace downtown in Lower Manhattan, and they had full-length mirrors in the ladies' parlor, which back then no one had a full-length mirror. So these things that we kind of take for granted back then were just, ingenious and amazing.
How did this idea of a department store get transported across the pond from Paris to New York? You said the Marble Palace. Was it just coincidental that people had the same ideas at the same time, or was it something that was seen in Paris and adopted elsewhere?
Yeah, it was seen in Paris and adopted elsewhere. It was Alexander Turney Stewart, who was kind of the first department store magnate here in America, and he was an immigrant from, I think, Ireland or Scotland, and he actually became the third richest man in the country as a result of his department stores after Astor and Vanderbilt. So he did quite well for himself. But he created the Marble Palace, which was the first one, and then he eventually created the Crystal. The cast iron palace rather, and these were, yes, the first department stores. I mean, there's some controversy what is exactly the first store in America, but I'm going with that one. So
What This is not a history question, by the way. This is like a contemporary theory question or just one to knock around with friends. What exactly is shopping? Is it about buying? Is it about looking at stuff? Is it about teasing yourself? Like people say I'm going shopping, and I always think, like, what does that mean? I walk into a store and I buy something and I walk right out. Did I shop or did I just go find what I wanted? What does this mean? What is shopping?
such good questions. Thank you. I do think it depends on the individual. I would say my husband shops the same way you do. I think
Right.
shopping is the way I shop is quite different. It's an experience. You go to discover things, which is really what the department store was about. It was, window shopping, for instance, just perusing and looking around. Women, we infer what's in style by watching what other women are wearing a lot of times, looking at what's on the shelves, what are the mannequins wearing. You're absorbing all that environment. You're going and suddenly you just decide to try on a hat and it looks amazing and you buy a hat. That's kind of what we mean in that bigger sense of shopping. I mean, not just going in and buying a shirt quickly and leaving.
Did you shop if you didn't buy?
Yes, like window shopping, for instance, that
Okay.
was sort of this entire new pastime. Before, never. You couldn't really go into a dry goods store and just wander around and look at things and, try them on. You had to go in and go out. And so it was an entirely new thing. Absolutely, you could go and maybe you couldn't afford it, but you decided you wanted to work hard and, save your money so you could. So, it didn't really matter. The purchasing wasn't the point.
All right. So NYC is a city that I love. It will always be my hometown in a lot of ways, not every way, but a lot of ways. I assume it's a city that you love. You've written two books about it now. New York City, at the time these department stores were getting popular, it is perceived, at least it's portrayed in contemporary history works, as being very gross, very dirty, The streets were nasty. And the department store, it seems like just from going through your book, was kind of like a place of refuge. Can you describe how much that might have impacted the popularity of these places?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Perfumes. There would be entire counters filled with perfumes. You could try on all sorts of perfumes or a plethora of leather gloves, candy aisles. They had, candy counters rather. They had all sorts of things like that a regular person wouldn't necessarily have any access to, any connection with. And in fact, the early department stores were quite controversial. The women that worked in them, there was a whole hand wringing about how they were going to become morally corrupt because they were around such opulent goods that they would fall into a life of crime in order to afford these things, that it was too tempting. So, it was an entirely different moment in time. And even shoplifting was a thing. So it was, yeah, very
What
what
were
we
the penalties severe?
Yes, there was actually like a hysteria of shoplifting at one point where it was all over the newspapers that women would just, grandmothers, women who were very wealthy and had no reason to do it, would just be caught with all these, having shoplifted all these goods. It was just a new kind of experience and people went a little crazy.
All right. So when does Fifth Avenue start to become Fifth Avenue? I, remember walking down there, especially with my grandmother. It was kind of like these stores that you were almost intimidated to walk by. I mean, we'd kind of walk by like the stores were on fire because she didn't want me to go in there and, cause a ruckus or anything like that. When does that Fifth Avenue start to develop and how?
Yeah, so first there was sort of in that Gilded Age era, Ladies Mile, which really started between Astor Place and kind of Madison Square Park, in Lower Manhattan, along Fifth Avenue, but more like Sixth Avenue, that area. And it slowly migrated north as people migrated north, as the city started to develop and it was less, wildlife uptown and actually, wealthy homes. One of the first department stores to actually move up there was Henry Bendel's, which moved to 57th Street in 1914. So that was sort of the very, very beginning. Back then, that was not, it was still a very residential area at the time, but it slowly during that early part of the century started to develop where all the big stores wanted to be along that row.
So there are three women who this book is generally about. Of course, there are more in it, but the women's name, the names of the women, and I hope I get them right, are Hortense Odlum, Dorothy Shaver, and Geraldine Stutz. Why did you feel the need to bring them out from the shadows after all these years and decades and tell the story of these three women who we should say one of them, Hortense ran Bonwit Teller, Dorothy ran Lord and Taylor, and Geraldine ran Henri Bendel, right?
Henry Bendel's. You
Henry
could say it in
Bendel.
the American way.
Sorry. Why bring these women out after all these years and show the world who they are?
Um, yeah. I had wanted to do something, I was looking for a new book idea and my agent wanted me to look at department stores, but I really didn't want to write about buildings. I wanted to try to expand that and really focus on people. And so I just started kind of researching and I stumbled upon Dorothy and Geraldine first. And their lives were so fascinating. I just kind of went down a research rabbit hole. It was during the pandemic and I was home and didn't have a lot of other things to do. So I really delved in there. And then I found Hortense and I felt like the three of them, they were each so different and they were in their own eras, but they really spoke to one another and kind of told this story of what the department store was, what it meant for women, and even the evolution of women in work, which was very interesting to me as a working woman. So that's how I kind of got into it.
I want to ask what, when you say you were researching, what exactly does research consist of when you're in this kind of a topic where it's three women who weren't necessarily public women. I mean, they weren't in public office. So what did you find and how did you piece together these stories?
It was not easy. It's never easy telling the story of people who were not, super famous because the materials are somewhat limited. But Dorothy Shaver was probably the most famous of the women in her lifetime. And she had, all of them had a lot of news articles written about them during the time that they were, active. So I obviously had that to go with. I traveled to each of their hometowns. I met with, family members, ancestors. I managed to find documents that, relatives had things like that. In the case of Geraldine, she's more recent, so I was able to do, gumshoe reporting and just speak to people who'd worked with her. But it was really cobbling everything together. Hortense was the only one who actually, she had written an autobiography in 1939, so I was able to use that. But the other two, neither of them have ever had biographies written about them. So it was somewhat challenging.
And how big of a news archive is there when it comes to these three women? Can you just go back in the papers and find articles about them? And I guess that I would also ask that about department stores. How much literature is there about the structure and the origins of these things?
Yeah, there's more about the stores themselves because there's been histories of Macy's, for instance, or there's a lot of materials about who Henry Bendel was, for instance. So that was somewhat easier. The Dorothy actually has a archive in the Smithsonian. So I was very lucky because she was a much more public facing figure. They have extensive documents there. So I went to the Smithsonian and did a lot of research. And also Radcliffe, Harvard, has some of her papers. So I was able to do that. I love ProQuest, which I don't know if any of your other interviewees have talked about it, but
No, I
it
don't
is.
think so. I hear about
Okay.
LexisNexis and newspapers.com a lot, but
Interesting. Okay. Well, I favor ProQuest. It's you just need a library card to use it, and it's quite amazing. I used it all for the plaza extensively. You basically can search with, like a keyword search. So basically, it's a Google for all sorts of newspapers over, 200 years. So I use that to do a lot of my clip searches.
how did you compare, or how do you compare writing about hotels and the idea of a building and what happened in a building versus department stores and the people who ran them? What was it like to flow from one topic into the other?
I felt a lot of responsibility with this book because it is women's lives. I mean, these are their lives that I have in my hands. So the way that I wrote about them and presented them, it was very important to me that I tried my best to do, all of them justice, even when there were some tricky, maybe not so positive stories, about their lives or decisions they made. With the plaza, it was really about kind of finding fun stories and looking at ways that the building kind of reflected what was happening in New York in a larger way, and using it as kind of this lens to tell the New York story. With this, it was really about these individual women and also other women who worked in the stores, and how the whole concept of department stores evolved. So I felt a lot more personally responsible.
We last chatted with you 5 years ago, which is, it doesn't feel like that long, but it is a long time and things change. Social media has changed. The way we do these interviews have changed. The way we meet with people have changed. I guess I never even thought that I could see my guests one day, and now it's like every episode is done like this. I'm wondering how your impression of yourself as a writer and as a media personality has been changed by all of these changes. There are a lot of demands now, social media, multimedia. The electronic world has placed a lot of different requirements on people who used to just write for a living.
Yes. That is very true.
You
What can
used
I
to be able
say?
to sit in the
Um,
office and type all day. Now look at you.
I know. I am no longer a writer. I now consider myself a small business owner, is how I feel. It's a very different thing. Um, you know, first of all, I think when I started the Plaza, I considered myself much more of a reporter, of a journalist. I at this point now see myself more as a writer. I of course do some journalism, and I still use my journalism skills, but I feel like I'm much more of an author, book author. So I've changed in the way that I see my career and the work I'm doing. Um, so that has changed. In terms of social media, I mean, you are talking to me now. We're about 13 days, I think, 12 days, 13 days away from my book coming out into the world. And it has been a completely different experience than I've had with the Plaza. I have been very active on social media, doing lots of videos
You
with
have been. I
fun
know. I see them all the time.
with fun, tidbits about the book, trying to get people excited. Pre-orders are incredibly important. Please pre-order the book or order it if you're listening. It's much more, the onus is much more on us. There's a lot of expectation. I have a wonderful publisher who I love, and an amazing editor. But the expectation is that the authors are doing a lot of their own marketing and publicity. So, that is a mixed bag. I mean, in some ways, I appreciate that I have more control over my career, but in other ways, it does put a lot more responsibility on us to kind of translate the information that we have. So.
Were you ready to be this type of personality? I mean, New York, newspaper writers are like sitting at their desk all day. At least that's my impression of them as a TV guy. Are you comfortable with doing this stuff, or did it take work?
No, I know newspaper reporters are, print stained, like
Yeah.
with their, yeah, in the back of the newsroom. Yeah, it's been a transition. I mean, I love talking about what I'm doing, and I love doing things like this, so it's super fun. But it has been a different skill set. I am not a TV journalist like you, so being in front of a camera is not something I, knew a lot about. I did have, some experience with the Plaza. I was lucky enough to do a bunch of TV, but yeah, it's now authors, even journalists, even print journalists have to be kind of brands themselves, right? We have to kind of make names for ourselves. It's not enough to be as anonymous as it once was, which I think is a mixed bag, honestly. I do have trouble giving opinions about things. I've really been trained. I mean, obviously I have my biases, that I'm, not always aware of, but I was trained to not, write opinion. So, having to be more opinionated has been something that I've had to
Yeah, I
learn.
mean, and that's a challenge for me too. I mean, I don't know if it's a challenge. I guess that's just the way my cake is sort of baked. Um, People say that people hear that I have a podcast and they think it's going to be me spouting off, and I'm like, I don't know that I've ever given any opinions on this podcast, let alone when I write a TV story.
Exactly. Yeah, I feel the same way. I mean, so like I had to write an op-ed for as part of my publicity for this, and it was so hard taking a stand about a topic,
Yeah, right.
even a topic about department stores. So yeah, I
How
feel
many
you.
department stores, and we are going to get back to the plot of this all the way,
Yeah.
by the way, but I
No.
just want to ask how many department stores are left? And did that present a challenge in how you marketed this book to, I guess your agent asked you, but to at least a publisher? How did you make it relevant to people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the Plaza, department stores evoke a nostalgia in people. It's something that, like you said, your grandmother. I mean, me too. I remember my grandmother and even my mom when I was a kid going, we would go to Bloomingdale's to buy our school clothes in August, and it was very exciting. So, I think that it evokes a nostalgia, and I think that idea is what people found compelling. I'm hoping, and it feels like that. You know, a lot of the comments I get on my videos and social media and stuff are about all these memories people have of when they bought their wedding dress at Bonwit Teller or whatever it was, you know. So I feel like that's part of it. Yeah, I
Yeah.
can't remember what the first part of your
No,
question
no,
was.
no. That's right. You answered it. It's perfect. Let's go back to the plot then. I want to ask, Hortense, you just said it. Never forgot the first thing she bought. And I never did either. I was at Fifth Avenue. I think it's maybe one of the first things. It probably was at FAO Schwartz, but like the memory that's burned in my head is shopping with my grandmother, and I felt so special going into the new Nike store. Believe it or not, I was a Nike stock owner. Um, and yeah, it was my bar mitzvah
How old
present.
were
I
you?
was like 12. It was my bar mitzvah present. My grandma thought it would be fun, and it was fun. I felt special holding the bag. It was like 5 shares, by the way. Uh, I felt special holding the bag. Um, you also said you remembered your first purchase. Tell us about that nostalgia that you have for the first thing you
Yeah.
bought. You said it at the end of the book.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I do. I remember, you know, the driving in from New Jersey and getting to go to Bloomingdale's and picking out a bunch of clothes that I got to wear for school, was very exciting. And I really looked forward to it. Or, you know, sitting on Santa's lap with my grandmother, you know, and then she would take me to the tea room. Those things, you know, are really happy memories. And also just, you know, even items of clothing in my 20s, you know, finding this cool discount shirt that I still have at Barney's. You know, that those things were fun. They were adventurous and you felt good and it was an adrenaline rush. So
And how important was that feeling for Hortense?
I think it was very important for Hortense. You know, she grew up, I don't know if you want to talk about it, but she grew up
Yeah, please.
very, yeah, she grew up so, you know, in a whole different universe, very far from the world of Fifth Avenue and department stores. She grew up in St. George, Utah, which was you know, more of a pioneer town, and she really made her own clothes and grew a lot of her own food. So it was a very different thing. And she moved to New York when she was a young mother, and yeah, she had to find a dress in a hurry for cheap to wear to her husband's colleague. They were going to their house for Thanksgiving, and they did not have a lot of money, and she did not have a lot of time or choice. And she left her baby napping in Brooklyn and ran into Manhattan and bought a dress very quickly while the baby was napping and got back before the baby woke up, which I was a little
Yeah,
wow.
right.
I
Yeah,
don't
right.
know if that would happen nowadays,
No,
but
I can promise it wouldn't. And you
yeah,
know that too.
exactly. But yeah, so that really made an impact on her because she really had a very tight budget, and the women at the department store were not very nice or helpful, and she had trouble finding something to wear.
And explain how she becomes a magnet. I mean, basically, from what I can gather, she took over the company from her husband, and those initial experiences of shopping, she kind of figures out what women want.
Yeah, you know, her husband ends up becoming extremely wealthy in the Great Depression, probably one of the few Americans who had fortuitously sold most of his stock right before the 1929 crash. So he was this Wall Street tycoon, and he acquired Bonwit Teller through various things. And um, Hortense ended up going there, and you know, she had an instinct for, she was a woman, she was a shopper. She understood this was the 1930s, it was the Great Depression, and women really did not have big careers. Most women did not. But she was named president, and under her, I mean, the store became more profitable than it was in the 1920s jazz age when the economy was booming. So she did an amazing job, and she always saw herself as a hostess. Essentially, she eschewed the concept that she was a businesswoman. She did not like that term, but she saw herself as a hostess, welcoming people to her home, you know, at a dinner party, for instance. That's how she saw her job as president of the department store, and it really worked.
Dorothy Shaver, you say, transformed fashion during World War II. So we've got kind of a Great Depression storyline here, and we also have a World War II storyline here.
Yeah.
Explain how perceptive she was and how she understood what people would want as the world changed under their feet.
Yeah, Dorothy Shaver was a very important person in fashion history and really American history. She she in the 1930s, she was one of the first people to really understand this idea that Americans could also be designers, fashion designers, that it wasn't all about Paris. Before that, you know, America, the garment district here, it was really just kind of mass producing clothes. They were largely cheap knockoffs of Parisian designs. If there were designers, most of them just toiled anonymously in these big warehouses, you know, translating these Parisian dresses for an American public. Um, and she really saw a hole in the market, that there were all these Americans living much different lifestyles than what Parisian women were wearing and needed different kinds of clothing, and really it was the American designers who could serve them and answer that need. So she Lord and Taylor, under her guidance, was the first store to advertise American designers' names in their newspaper articles, so in their newspaper advertising rather.
What is so interesting to me about all of this is that you have this sort of fashion stream going on here. Fashion is changing and the world is changing at the same time. How do you think the the war impacted what people perceived as being important and luxurious and how they wanted to express themselves?
During World War II, when Paris was occupied by the Nazis, all the manufacturing there really stopped. And America, which, you know, as I mentioned, the garment industry was really based on Parisian copies. All of a sudden, were sort of stuck because they didn't have these new designs coming in. And Dorothy, who had already sort of promoted American designers, really doubled down. And she wasn't the only one. Vogue, and there was a whole group of women, largely women, editors, fashion editors, publicists, who had formed something called the Fashion Group, and they really started promoting this concept that American designers should be what we focus on. And you know, Lord and Taylor created a department where it was all about American designers. They had their advertising, and you know, Elizabeth Hawes, Claire McCardle, all these early young designers started getting all the support from Dorothy, and something sort of they started creating what was called the American look, which was essentially sportier clothes. In Paris and a lot of the Parisian designs, they were very formal. But Americans, you know, were more sporty. We wanted to go to football games and, you know, picnics and run around with our kids, and we didn't want such fancy dresses. So these American designers really started focusing on sportswear, and it became a real American thing.
The best advancement in clothing, particularly for men, has been making suits sportier. I mean, I can wear basically sneakers and like stretchy pants, and all I need is a tie and a decent shirt that can also be stretched to look like I'm doing
Absolutely.
business these days. It's
I know.
fantastic.
America is definitely, I feel like, the always at the forefront of athleisure, all of that, obviously,
uh,
spandex, leggings.
Geraldine Stutz of say it again, Henri Bendel. How what is it?
You know what? He was actually from New
Henry?
Orleans. It's just Henry Bendel.
Henry. Okay. All right. It's
It's just
deceptive.
spelled that way.
Yeah, there you go. Geraldine Stutz of Henry Bendel. She transforms the store space itself. Explain how.
Yes. So Geraldine was really a young fashion magazine editor, and she was sort of plucked by the owner of Henry Bendel's to remake the store. The store used to be this very fancy, you know, expensive store where, you know, the wealthy New Yorkers all shop, the carriage trade, but it had grown really dowdy, and, you know, no one young wanted to shop there anymore, and it was losing money. So he thought Geraldine, she was so fashionable. She had such a great eye. She'd be wonderful. So she was only 33 when she was hired in 1959 to take over Henry Bendel's. And The first thing she confronted was actually the physical store. Unlike, most department stores, which are very big, Henry Bendel's was small and it was quite narrow and long. And so its main floor was kind of a tunnel shape and it wasn't great for shopping. So she came up with like a really ingenious idea called the Street of Shops. Her, in addition to her architect, um, uh, who also was part of this vision, they kind of created this street, where instead of an alleyway, there were all these little shops on either side, and you could walk down the pavement essentially and shop in all these little boutiques, whether it was hosiery you were looking for, or hats, or jewelry. You could go into these little stores, and they were very well curated, and they all had their own things, and it was a very special kind of experience. So that was really the beginning of this idea of boutiques within stores. So a lot of times now we take it for granted. Target has a Sephora in there, or there's little boutiques within a department store that you see. But she really came up with that idea. I mean, the Henry Bendel Street of Shops was the first one to really take that concept. So it was totally revolutionary for department stores, and now it's widely copied. But back then it was really an amazing feat of genius.
I
So.
think it's so interesting that you had three names early in the book of men who were in the business, and I knew their names, but I did not know the names of the women. You mentioned Macy, Filene, and Bloomingdale. I guess there's two of them, the Bloomingdales. What does that say to you about is it a coincidence? Is there a reason that I knew the men and not the women?
I think, this is the history of women. I think now we're starting to write the canon, but there are countless women that did amazing things that have been forgotten to history. So, there's a lot of effort now to really put some attention on that. But I think, they were the owners. They put their names on the buildings. The women didn't own the stores, but they ran them. I mean, back in 1906, I have someone from San Francisco who was going to Paris by herself to Parisian, fashion shows in 1906, a 20-something-year-old, department store buyer. There were these incredibly powerful women who were doing these amazing things, and they were largely unsung. So, and it was really them who ran the entire business, which is why, I mean, I focus on Hortense, Dorothy, and Geraldine in part because they were presidents. They did run the business. I mean, they were running thousands of employees they were in charge of, and their budgets were in the 50 million, $100 million range in today's money. These were giant businesses, but they weren't given their due.
We'll get to online shopping in a second, but now they jam a department store into like a CVS. How do you reflect on that?
I know. It's a whole different thing now. I mean, the concept of department stores, much like the grand hotels of like the Plaza, there's been so much consolidation in the industry and so much shrinkage that the department stores we have today are largely bifurcated by market. So instead of, it used to be you could go to the department store, you started out this talk, saying you could go to the Western Union, you could go get food, you could buy something, you could even drop your kids at a nursery while you're shopping. I mean, there were all these things. Now it's and you could buy expensive things. You could buy a mink coat, and you could go downstairs to the bargain basement and buy, a coat on clearance. There were all sorts of things like that. Now you go to Marshall's or you go to Saks Fifth Avenue. Everything is very bifurcated by the market. So it's either very high end typically or more discount.
You say that shopping on Fifth Avenue gives you the feeling of invigoration. You feel great. How does online shopping make people feel, make you feel, make me? When I online shop, I have to say, like, I kind of like it because I like get what I want right away and I know what I want. But I'm also a very particular guy. I'm not like a browser. Online
Totally.
shopping for the browser. Is that good or bad?
I mean, it's a totally different experience. It's to me, it's more like what we were talking about in the beginning, which is what is shopping. To me, it's more the way you shop, or my husband also buys all of his clothes online, only
Right.
online.
Me too. Yeah. Other than a
And
suit, that might be it. Yeah.
because right, because if you go in and you know what you want, you can get what you want. It's a very convenient, it's very easy. And believe me, I shop online all the time. But it's the exploration of what the pastime used to be, the experience of trying something new or discovering something that you didn't even know you wanted or needed or even would look good on you. That is kind of gone now. That is much harder to find.
All right. Favorite portrayal of a department store in a movie?
In a movie,
Yeah.
can I do a TV
You
show?
can do any I'll make an exception. Go ahead.
There's no rules. Okay.
No.
Um, I mean, I love Rachel Menken in Menken's Department Store in Mad Men. She was actually based, I don't know if you remember, but she was potentially Don Draper's one true love,
Mm.
according to there's a Reddit about her. She was a fabulous character. She was very strong. And she took over a department store, her father's department store, Menken's, and it was actually based on a real woman who I write about in my book, Beatrice Fox Auerbach, who owned G Foxes in Hartford, Connecticut, if anyone is from Hartford here. And she was really like Rachel Menken. And yeah, I love that. I love that portrayal.
I'm going Elf, Gimbals.
Oh, there you go.
Gimbals, even though I've
Okay.
seen it 50,000 times because my daughter never stops watching Elf. Um, all right.
That
A
makes
couple other
sense.
questions. One is you have a podcast now, How Books Work. I love other book podcasts. Why was that an idea for you to open up this industry to the podcast world and explain to people how books work?
Thanks for bringing that up. Yes, there are a number of podcasts for writers that are mostly geared towards fiction writers. There are the ones that are out there for nonfiction writers tend to be interviewing an author like you do about their book or about their writing process. But there's not really a lot about the industry, the nonfiction industry, and it really is different. The fiction book world and the nonfiction book world, I mean, have a lot obviously in common, but there's also a lot of things that are quite different for the two markets. And I felt like there was a real dearth of transparency in what the nonfiction book market is like. And there's so many things that this is my second book. There is so much I don't know and don't understand. And all my fellow authors out there who I'm friends with feel very similarly. There's so much about what happens behind the scenes at our publishing houses or, wherever it might be, that we don't even know what questions to necessarily ask. So our idea was really my friend Alice Robb, fellow author, and I was to interview the people who don't typically get interviewed in the book world, the editors, the salespeople, the marketing, the people behind the scenes about what is really happening, what is going on in the industry, what do we as writers need to know, what questions should we be asking, how is the market, all of that. So that was the concept behind it.
Uh, do you see, are you getting interest from the larger public in this, or did you find that authors are mostly interested in listening?
We've only released, this is our first season, so we've only released, I guess, like 5 or 6
That's
episodes
good. Yeah,
now.
that's a lot.
So
Yeah.
yeah, so I can't tell. I mean, the feedback I've been getting is mostly from authors. I would love the public to read about. I think that they'd probably find it really interesting. Or if you ever have even thought about writing a book, it can be really constructive. So yeah.
You're working on a history of Fifth Avenue, not necessarily the shopping part of it. I was a child in New York City growing up at a school that was at 104th between Madison and Fifth. So
Oh.
I know Fifth Avenue, at least that part of it. I know most of it. Why Fifth Avenue at large, not just where people go to shop?
It's the 200th anniversary of Fifth Avenue actually coming up. And so it's a coffee table book produced by Asoline, which is sort of like a Rizzoli. And it's amazing photos celebrating all this incredible history of Fifth Avenue. So the buildings, the fun things, the parades, it's all sorts of things. So I'm writing an introductory essay for them and all the captions for the images. So that's what
We
I'm
we
working.
had such fun going as school kids from across the street. We were on the, I guess it'd be the west side of Fifth Avenue, and we would go. Oh, no, I guess. Well, let me think. No, east side of Fifth Avenue, and we would cross over to the west side to um, go into Central Park. And we had such fun going to Lasker Rink and to the gardens that are there. It was always a pleasure. And I guess we, as kids, you don't think we're crossing Fifth Avenue, but there we were.
Yeah, exactly, right? I know, city kids. Me too. I was doing that in high school, hanging out at Central Park a lot after school.
Yeah.
So
What is it about NYC, about New York City that gives so much for an author to grab onto? What is it about that town?
I know, gosh, there's just so much history here, you know. It really is. Um, it's so rich. The history of New York is so rich. I mean, I know that we're blamed a lot in the media for being, you know, coasters, East Coast, West Coast, and there's a lot of us here in New York for sure, but it really is a fascinating history. I mean, it's the history of America, I feel like, in microcosm a lot of ways. So I mean, certainly doing this book, I've seen that. I mean, everything for the most amazing thing from the hell fighters, which I never didn't know about. I mean, I've learned so many things to I was just writing about the Formula One racer who recently just did donuts in the middle of Fifth Avenue celebrating actually the race in Miami that just happened a few weeks ago. So
All right, we made it to the end. I got one last question for you. This book is dedicated to your parents. Why?
aw, yeah. I dedicated my first book to my husband. It's always tricky. My kids feel very left out at this point, so I
That's
have
big
to
real
write the
estate
third
too.
one
That
now.
front, the front of that book is big real estate. Sometimes it's only two words people read.
I know. The truth is, I've always written these books for my mom. Like, writers often have a reader in mind when they're writing, and my mom is always my reader. I don't know why, but she just happens to be who I'm thinking about when I'm writing. So it was a no-brainer for me. My parents have given me so much. They've given me New York. If it wasn't for them, I mean, they still live in Soho. So if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't even have New York. So I don't know. I felt like I wanted to dedicate it to them, and I think they're pretty happy about it. So there you go.
Julie Satow, the author of When Women Ran Fifth Avenue, Glamour and Power at the Dawn of American Fashion. Thank you so much for being here and for coming back, too.
Thank you so much. This was a blast. I really appreciate it.
It was awesome. Check out the book and also her website, juliesatow.com. She's on the website formerly known as Twitter at Julie Satow. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping this show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.